So welcome everybody and thank you for joining. I'm Jennifer Nason, Global Chairman of Investment Banking at JP Morgan Chase and former Chair of the American Australian Association. I am very pleased to welcome Robert Thomson, Chief Executive of News Corp and a great friend and patron of the American Australian Association. The discussion today is entitled Life in the New Abnormal, the shape of things to come in media and technology, and we will dig into the issues impacting journalism and the media in the current environment and how News Corp and its various businesses around the world are navigating this very complex world today. This is the fourth in a series of webinars that the AAA and our Business Council are hosting, and we welcome everyone to today's session. So I would like to thank all of you that pre-submitted questions. I have incorporated many, if not all of them, into the questions that I'm going to ask Robert this evening. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we won't be doing live Q&A today. So welcome, Robert, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jennifer.
So I think everybody on the call today is very familiar with Robert, but I thought by way of very brief background, Robert, as Chief Executive of News Corp, oversees a company with global operations across a range of media, including news and information services, subscription video services in Australia, book publishing, and digital real estate services. Robert previously served as Editor-in-Chief of Dow Jones & Company and Managing Editor at the Wall Street Journal, which became under his leadership the largest by circulation newspaper in the US. Before joining Dow Jones, Robert was editor of the Times of London, where he presided over a significant expansion of its readership in print and online. Prior to that, he was editor of the US edition of the Financial Times, editor of the Weekend FT, a particular favourite of mine, assistant editor of the Financial Times, and foreign news editor. Robert had been a correspondent himself in both Tokyo and Beijing. His first job in journalism was at the infamous Herald in Melbourne as a copy boy and a finance and general affairs reporter before becoming the paper's Sydney correspondent. So again, Robert, thank you for joining us. And I'm sure there's a lot of stories we could share about those early days at the Herald, but that is not the conversation for today.
Not appropriate for this audience.
So let's start at the sort of macro level, if we could. The dramatic events of this year, from an impeachment trial way back in January to the pandemic, to the shutdown and the ensuing economic crisis, to the horrific tragedy of George Floyd and the resulting unrest, to the upcoming election. And it's only June, by the way. How are you as a company and as a news organisation just dealing with it all?
Jennifer, look, we're all in uncharted waters, personally, professionally, commercially, but it's best in these unusual circumstances to take as broad a perspective as possible for fear of becoming too narrow, too myopic. And as you say, I spent 5 years in Japan and I have a pompous fondness for Basho, the poet best known for his haiku. And if you were to take one line from Basho and commit it to memory, it would be, every day is a journey and the journey itself is a home. And because we are all collectively trying to traverse an unmapped landscape and as a company remain an energetic, creative collective and deal with the inevitable personal complications, sometimes crises, that inexorably arise at a time like this. And so understanding a cultural cartography is crucial for every company and frankly every person. On the issue of minority representation, we all have much work ahead. At News Corp in the US, 20% of our managers and senior managers are from minority backgrounds and 56% of managers and senior managers are women. So it's rightly a time of reckoning, but that time of reckoning comes at a moment of political polarization. And there's no doubt that social media has contributed to the anti-social tendencies. Angsty becomes angry all too easily. And COVID has heightened, complicated and exacerbated the underlying conditions, the personal, social, national, global. A pandemic is by definition global. And the challenge has been to ensure that pandemic doesn't become panic, as was the case early on with the binge buying of certain items. We have to be decorous in our language. So if you must, lavatory stationery.
So, Robert, on COVID specifically, how have you and your leadership team sort of been navigating this? Because you have various businesses, you have a very global footprint, and the sort of work from home and now the return to work formulas vary region to region, depend on the businesses that you're in. So how are you, as chief executive, how are you sort of managing and dealing with all of that?
Well, first of all, by having a very committed, talented team, not just in this country, but around the world, who are talking to each other, learning from each other. And that is a comparative advantage, that they can share experiences from different situations. And you look at teleworking or tele not working. It's ironic that one of the biggest difficulties was a pre-existing condition, particularly in the US, which is lousy Wi-Fi. In fact, the real challenge of work from home has not been technical, but cultural. If you had a corroded corporate culture, working from home would be particularly difficult because you lack the social synapses to communicate, to share, let alone to create. And so thankfully, because of the culture that Rupert has inculcated, we have a strong identity, and that is helped by a sense of purpose right across our companies. Our journalists obviously have a real sense of mission at this moment. But it's also true of HarperCollins, our book publisher, and Realtor and REA, the digital property businesses, and Foxtel in Australia. The traffic to some of our news sites has more than doubled in recent months, year on year, and that to the property websites is at record levels. Now, some of that is no doubt digital drive-bys, the insatiable quest for entertainment. But a significant percentage will actually be people contemplating the future of their family in a post-COVID world. And as for returning to work, which definitionally sounds like people have been doing no work at home, the imperative is that employees feel comfortable, secure, and that the social architecture of the office is of itself patently reassuring. I recall talking to the CEO of an airline after 9/11, and he said the most important thing was that when passengers boarded the plane, that they'd look at the cockpit door and saw that it was reinforced, seemingly impregnable, and that was psychologically the most important thing he could do to aid uncertain passengers. I mean, that was largely theatre, but in a way it was meaningful theatre. And in crafting our contemporary offices, we need the synecdoche of security, signs, semblances, meaningful motifs, from sanitizer to sensibility. At our HQ, as you know, we have a genuinely open plan office, but seemingly those layouts are potentially fertile territory for infection, at least pre-vaccine. When is a hot desk a hot spot? Mm. And so our teams across the various companies are doing a vast amount of work on spacing, cleaning, and not just plain vanilla cleaning, but deep cleaning. Actually, when you hear the words deep cleaning, you do wonder exactly how hygienic offices were before they were
exactly
deep cleaned. But that's just one part of a very complex psychological and sociological equation. There's no point in having a germ-free office if it is the commute to work that's unnerving for employees. And there's no doubt that the subway in New York has been a source of spread. The taxis, from our own experience, obviously vary drastically in the degree of cleanliness. So you can't order everyone to work on a certain date without being cognizant of those concerns. So the return will be a blend. It won't be everybody back at once. It will be dependent on things we can control, and occasionally logistics a little beyond our control. But you just have to exceed expectations on reassurance. But those expectations are obviously influenced by public announcements by other companies. Company X or Y in Silicon Valley says they won't be returning until January 1st. But really, those sorts of announcements are really meaningless prognostications, unrelated to the facts, and at times, frankly, superficial showboating. But ultimately, for us, the reason that 95% of our employees within a few days were successfully working from home, it was not technological, but it really was cultural. You can have a network, but you just won't have cohesion if there's a dysfunctional dynamic in your company. And look, the halcyon days are still distant, but if we are seeking lessons from this moment, there's no better source than Albert Camus and his movingly profound work, The Plague, which I was reluctantly forced to read at school in Melbourne, but coincidentally revisited willingly early last year. And two quotes stand out. I'm going to read them because I don't want to mess them up. So you have to excuse me for a moment. Quote number one: "What is natural is the microbe. All the rest, health, integrity, purity, is a product of the human will." And the second quote that I think we should all bear in mind is, "What we learn in a time of pestilence is that there are more things to admire in people than to despise."
Mm. Very interesting. Well, as someone who's coming to you live from Long Island, New York, and having been out here for 3 months, it's been, and fortunate enough to be able to be on Long Island, New York, it's been a time of to sort of reflect and think about a lot of things, although we're all still working very, very hard, albeit remotely. So Robert, you've actually announced a number of sort of strategic initiatives around News Corp, a sort of reshaping of the business and the portfolio. Has this largely just been an acceleration of trends or decisions or initiatives sort of already underway, or how much has been a direct response to the last few months?
In part, a direct response, but really no business can stand still. Probably the most important 20th century Chinese writer was Lu Xun, whose works were thoughtful and ambiguous enough to appeal to readers of most political persuasions, which is hard these days. He wasn't a management consultant, and no offense to the management consultants on the call, but I became more interested in him after visiting his hometown in Shaoxing, which is between Hangzhou and Ningbo, not that far from Shanghai. And the only thing it's famous for apart from him is rice wine. He observed, and I think it's an interesting way of thinking of strategy, that hope is a path on a mountainside. At first, there is no path, but then there are people who journey that way, and then there is a path. And that's a great articulation of how strategy can emerge in a company where you think, you plan, and the path is the actual execution where you bring the company and your people along with you on a journey. And so strategy, you would like to think, is partly a result of innovative thought and collective internal contemplation, but is inevitably fashioned by circumstance. And we are at the moment being influenced by extreme circumstances. For all of us, regardless of your business, there's been an exponential expansion in digital. And for us, necessarily a focus on mobile, a data imperative, and a priceless premium on quality, originality, and integrity. And we are, in many respects, a content company. But look, the trajectory was initiated by Rupert, and he has always wanted the company to be a startup upstart, avoiding the corporate calcification and the suffocating smugness that has become a characteristic of too many companies that have had success, and that success is almost inevitably followed by a period of inexorable decline. Now, you have to be respectful of traditions when you're crafting new strategies, custodians of culture, but you also have to sculpt the future. And I recall vividly when we acquired Dow Jones, which for those of you who have recollection of that acquisition, was a little controversial at the time. And it was a company that wasn't fulfilling its potential, is the polite way of putting it. But now it's obviously a glittering jewel in our crown. Now, many people have contributed to that renaissance, but I'll tell one story about Rupert with his restless curiosity and the constant questioning, the sort of innate suspicion of prestige and the allergy to complacency. Our predecessors at Dow Jones were going to close the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal, which has since become the best-selling. And his instinct was to invest, to expand, to experiment. And that experiment has been an ordinary success. But even that success can be seductive. The Wall Street Journal of 5 years ago cannot be the Wall Street Journal of 5 years hence. Mobile will indeed become more important. It's imperative. AI more acute. Data definitely more permissioned and precise. And all of those changing circumstances are and should be an influence on all of our businesses. And that's where we have an advantage, because whether it's books or newspapers or Foxtel or digital real estate, even though the sectors are different, a lot of the experiences are the same. A fast-loading website is a fast-loading website, and a slow-loading website is unacceptable. And you want executives of their own volition to be restless and relentless. And one of the most elegant sculptors of the English language was Thomas Babington Macaulay, and he was obviously of his time, but he wrote, and I paraphrase for the sake of a corporate conversation, the measure of an executive's real character is what she or he would do if she or he would never be found out. Which, when you think about it, is is innately profound, and what you want out of it. It's not about showing off. It's about performance. In other words, you hope, you believe, and I firmly do, that our executives, our senior managers, are taking necessary difficult decisions, not for the sake of tending their Twitter feed, but for the future. And in some companies in media, two potential curses are Twitter and Slack. So a reporter who overly focuses on his or her Twitter feed and image management is a lesser reporter. And journalists who agitatedly opine more on Slack channels than they report for a real audience are Slacktivists.
Yeah, very interesting, Robert. And your reference to Rupert's sort of disdain for prestige and the quote you gave, I often say to my kids, the only thing that matters is who you are when no one's looking. Because who you are when everyone's looking is generally not the same.
Exactly. Macaulay obviously copied you.
So Robert, just specifically around, and some of these questions did in fact come ahead of the call from various people who are now on the call. Things like what does happen to ads, fundamental sort of blocking and tackling. What happens to ad sales? When do we get back to pre-COVID levels? What's going to happen with the print business? Whether that's newspapers, are we all going all digital? Books and publishing, what is sort of happening there? Anything you can share with us this evening around those sort of blocking and tackling elements?
Yeah, look, COVID's obviously accelerated demand for news, but it actually hasn't helped the news industry in some respects anyway, because it's afflicted the news industry because of the decided decline in advertising. The advantage has been the increase in subscriptions, which has been quite dramatic at some of our publications. The question for us and for other publishers will be how much of that COVID cohort remains with you as the crisis abates. So for the subscription sites, the Wall Street Journal, the Times in London, the Australian, there has obviously been a surge in circulation revenue. And we've said this publicly, so hopefully not violating any SEC rules, but the decline in advertising has generally been somewhat greater. And if you look at, for example, digital books, it's fascinating because the question you ask is what percentage of the change that we're now seeing will remain after the end of the crisis, but there are certain tech trajectories that are not immutable. You know, about 4 years ago, ebooks were 23 to 24% of all books sold, but that's fallen to around 17% or so around a year ago. And if you asked lifelong publishing industry experts 5 or 6 years ago, they would have presumed that the number now would be closer to 40%. And actually, the only reason that digital sales have turned positive in recent years is the rise of the audiobook, which itself is a consequence of the iPhone and headphones. And the audiobooks have been around for a very long time, and in record format originally. And you think about how these trends suddenly become fashionable and then actually become entrenched as social habit. And you would have thought, for example, with the onset of COVID, that audiobooks would suddenly surge, and yet they didn't. They fell. And why? Because fewer people were commuting, and actually an increasing number of commuters had acquired the habit of listening to books. Now, actually, that number has revived in recent weeks, but it's a lesson as we examine each of the industries that you alluded to, that if you don't look at the logistics, if you ignore the social psychology, the habits of commuters, you'll surely never truly understand the evolution and the e-evolution of markets, which markets are an aggregation of hopes, dreams, insecurities, infelicities, instincts, intuitions, desires, an aggregation of all of us, actually. And the question that we're confronted with around behavior is what actions that people are now taking in what they consume, how they consume it, when they consume it. What contemporary actions will in the future become habits? And that will determine the success or otherwise of many of our products.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question for every business, in fact. And you know, as people think about returning to work, commuting, how they live their lives, how they travel, it's just, it is the great question right now as to what has profoundly changed and what will bounce back, that we will watch as we gradually come out of the immediate crisis. Robert,
so much of it, Jennifer, sorry to interrupt, it depends on a vaccine, to be honest, vaccine and treatments. There could, in a very short space of time, there could be a return to relative normalcy, but it won't be the old normal. It will be a new normal. At the moment, we're in the new abnormal. And I'm sure, as you must get asked a lot, when will travel restrictions be eased? How many people can crowd into an East Village bar? And there's endless debate about which letter of the alphabet best defines a potential recovery. Is it a V, a U, an L, a square root symbol? I've heard people keep coming up with all sorts of suggestions. But having had a small experience of Asian language and ideograms, I would mischievously suggest a Japanese hiragana character, and the one representing mu, if you look it up on the hiragana table, anyone can check. I wouldn't normally encourage people to use Google, but still. And it's down, a little around, and ultimately, but somewhat belatedly, a flourish. That's my symbol for you.
I'm going to Google that as soon as we're done, Robert. Look, for the benefit of everyone on the phone, I think everybody asked this question in advance, is about live sports, particularly in Australia. Do you have any do you want to speculate as to how this is coming back, in what regions, which sports? How is all this going to work, do you think?
Well, look, as the Australians on the call know, the winter sports, or the two big winter sports, rugby league and Aussie rules, have returned, but in a very different way. I mean, this is really the same as Premier League in England, which is games but no crowds. And I'm not sure if anyone on the call has watched an English soccer match in recent days with canned crowd noise, which is what you get on the broadcast. It's like watching a very badly dubbed Hungarian film from the early 1980s. It's somehow
I've seen a few of those.
Yeah. No doubt that it'll be more in sync as the sound sync, as people get more expert at pretending to be a crowd and trying to capture the ebb and flow of emotion and hope and sound. But it's at the moment the lips are not in sync, and the rhythms are discordant. There are challenges for all of these sports, depending on, particularly in Australia, particularly here with baseball, with later in the year NFL. If you have players getting sick, it completely disrupts the schedule. So the best laid plans, and we've seen that. For those of you who follow Australian football, the best team in the league, Essendon, by far the best actually, had a problem with one of its players testing positive, then testing negative, and then and so potentially much of the team would have had to go into quarantine, and matches delayed or forfeit or postponed. But it was a harbinger, I think, of the complexity to come before a vaccine, because it's inevitable, no matter how careful people are, that one or two players or assistants or coaches or whomever will become ill. And then what happens? And particularly, say, for example, with NFL, where you have a very tight schedule of games up until the end of the year and beyond, it gets complicated to reschedule. And I was talking to someone who knows a lot more about sport than I do, and they said part of it will be driven by the players. There are some sports where actually, because of the nature of the sport, and NFL is one, you have a very short lifespan as a player. So those players will be more inclined for that sport to go ahead. But then there are other sports, for example, like baseball, where you can go on well into your 30s, where a single season lost it will not necessarily have the same profound impact on a career. And so that's just one way of looking at the very difficult dynamic that all of these sports and all of these professionals, women and men, are dealing with at the moment.
Yeah, and I saw all the news around tennis, some tennis players, and so I understand it's complicated, but it's good to see at least some of the Aussie sports attempting to go back. So Robert, I just want to shift back to sort of journalism, the broader subject of journalism, and you're a journalist at heart and by profession. That is what you've spent your whole life doing. News Corp, you and Rupert in particular, have been very vocal advocates for journalism in the context of the big social media platforms and their, continued publishing and not paying for content. Can you talk a little bit about this issue? Why is it so important to you and to Rupert? And ultimately, is it a fight that you can win?
Well, it's an existential issue for journalism. Journalism around the world is unsustainable, and you would have thought that in a digital age, if you're a digital startup, without the cost of paper, without the cost of printing presses, that it should be easier to prosper. But whether it's Vice, whether it's Vox, whether it's BuzzFeed, none of these so-called digital natives have been successful either. And so there's something wrong with the ecosystem. But actually, we are, to your question, at a fascinating moment with negotiations underway in various countries. And dare I say, regulators primed to pursue cases, and a general understanding among savvy media companies that some of our credulous colleagues have in the past been digital dilettantes. And this confluence of consciousness, actually, as you say, one that would not have happened without Rupert or Lachlan, frankly, and the astute activism of a feisty few at News Corp over more than a decade. Because we've been contending with literally battalions of lawyers and legions of lobbyists dragooned by big digital. And there are, as well as the mindless myrmidons in the pay of Silicon Valley who are themselves exasperated that justice is a little closer to being done, i.e. Content being paid for. And that the sophistry of the past has been revealed as more vacuous and virtuous. And in particular, we've reached an agreement with Facebook in the US, and Mark Zuckerberg and I shared a stage here in New York a few months ago. And bluntly, my first question to Mark was, what took you so long? Because he had recognized, he had arrived at the place where he realized that he needed to pay for content and to ensure that there's a healthy ecosystem. The premium content demands a premium. And I do have faith in Sundar Pichai, personally, at Alphabet or Google, whatever you want to call it. But look, that's a complicated company. And he's in a conceptual contest with flat earthers and Philistines. And but to be frank and fair, regulators around the world have figured Google out. And a quick Google search by Google executives should reveal that immutable truth to them. And that those in that company who imperiously believe in the press's panhandlers in a sort of mendicant media, where they hand out a little money here and a little money there, that's tokenistic and unsustainable. And at the moment in the US, there are 50 state attorneys general who are looking to interview them, and across both parties. So it's a bipartisan concern. So in that sense, the Google gears is up.
So the ACCC in Australia recently announced restrictions on social platforms who use original journalism. So this is a potentially quite revolutionary initiative by the Australian government, and I think one of, if not the first of its kind, one of the first of its kind. Do you think it will stick? Is it going to work down there? What are the implications of this type of policy response, do you think?
Profoundly important. And the ACCC work on this subject is peerless. And it's something that every Australian should be proud of. And actually everybody on this call should, whatever your interest, read their digital report, because it's not just about journalism, it's about the digital landscape generally. And it's the most enlightened, well put together, well researched tech travelogue of its kind. And it's both illuminating and it's shone some light on the digital dark corners. And I know it's been read actually by regulators around the world. And I keep encountering ACCC phrases and formulations in London and in Brussels. The Vice President of the European Commission, Margaret Vestager, who for many years was a solitary voice of sanity, has seen the report. And so it's certainly added to the collective wisdom. And that, look, she of herself has done brilliant work. She's a brilliant individual and has exquisite taste in films. She, in a speech she once quoted from the original Blade Runner, referring to the potential loss of social value as being like tears in rain. But there are more regulators around the world ensuring that tears will be shed no more. And the importance of the ACCC proposals is there absolutely has to be a mandatory code for content, for algorithms, and for personal data. Because at the moment, there's a complete lack of algorithmic transparency. A tweak here and there, and information or views or values do disappear in the rain. And the data relationship between big digital and consumers is so obviously an unequal treaty. And for example, that's particularly the case for Amazon, where the data relationship between Amazon and its corporate clients is an unequal treaty. And one area there that regulators, not just in Australia, are focused on is that you can't dominate a horizontal marketplace like Amazon and have your products in sector verticals, as Amazon does with books. And for example, it has, depending on the market, around 95% of the audiobook market, which is just unsustainable when it also has audiobooks. And not just in Australia, but globally, the digital denouement is looming.
Yeah, we will, I think for everyone on this call, and certainly when we post the replay of this, we will make sure the link is on the AAA website for all of you, or any of you interested in reading the work by the ACCC. I agree, it's a very well done, and it's a very interesting read, no matter how educated you are around sort of journalism and what is going on right now. Do you think, Robert, having worked all over the world, do you think journalism is somehow fundamentally different between Australia, the US, the UK, or is it all basically the same, the issues basically the same?
It's in terms of revenue sustainability, the issues are similar, if not exactly the same. But when you look at, there are various estimates of how many journalists in the US have lost jobs and how many journalist jobs just have disappeared in the last 10 years. And it seems to be around a third and more obviously in some of the larger media companies. Every day of late, there have been announcements of redundancies. And as you know, in Australia, we've unfortunately ended print publication for many of our local and regional papers, and that they become all digital, which will affect some of our traditional partners in print. But that's not a decision taken lightly. That's a decision taken because we want to ensure that we can do as much journalism as possible on as many platforms as possible. But it's indicative of the challenge that not only we face, but publishers large and small, print and digital, are confronting around the world. It is that it's a dysfunctional digital landscape. The rewards have disproportionately gone to distributors, not to creators. Yeah. And it's rectifying that imbalance that's so important, which is, again, back to the ACCC work and the DOJ in Washington, the CMA in London. All the regulators they actually have been on a journey, and it's become more and more obvious to them the longer they've looked, the longer they've had experience of this debate, that whether it be journalism or some other professions, that unless you resolve these contradictions, the commercial damage is obvious and the social harm will be profound.
So look, we've touched on the big social media platforms. So, and technology has had a profound impact over the last decade or so on the news, the business of news, on journalism. Will technology continue to be transformative for the way news is delivered and consumed? Are we going to see more of user-generated content? Everybody's a journalist, sort of in the street with their cameras. And lastly, Robert, and sorry, this is like a triple question, for those budding journalists on the call today, what would you recommend for a career path? What experiences, what skills are you going to need if you're starting out on a career in journalism today?
Well, why don't I start with the last question first and
Sure.
try to give some guidance, which would be see if you can find a job in business journalism, financial journalism of some kind. It's still a very active market, and it helps you understand how societies work. It helps economics and finance and tech are at the heart of so much that makes a society a society. But it's also useful because you have to be precise, you have to be factual, you have to be financial, you have to be accurate. And inculcating precision early on in your professional life is really important. So, and then the permutations in journalism, once you have that experience of economics and finance, they tend to be greater than if you come in with a social perspective. Because I do sometimes worry that, and it's particularly pronounced in the US actually, that there are journalists who want to be activists. Well, if you want to be an activist, join an NGO. If you want to be a journalist, let the facts find the theme. Don't start with a theme and selectively use and not use facts to fit that theme. And so, and financial journalism imposes a discipline on you around facts, figures, which to some may seem a little tedious, but if accuracy is tedious, you're in the wrong profession. And there are certainly, I can still see career paths for young women and men in Australia, here in the US, who, if they do well in the early years of business journalism, they will do well in journalism, no doubt about it. So that's where I would start. User-generated content, well, I think we all know there's a lot of user-generated content. And the U in UGC, unfortunately, sometimes stands for ugly, not user, because the amount of digital detritus that passes for UGC is, I mean, we're overwhelmed by it, and it is not. Some of it's amazing. Where you get a photograph from somebody's iPhone of an incident and a video which can change social debate. That's really, really important, and that's where technology has helped educate. I mean, clearly videos can be distorted. And we have a company actually called Storyful, which seeks out the provenance of videos and seeks out trends in social media because one of the problems with technology is that it's becoming so sophisticated that your ability to manipulate video will become more dangerously successful for those who want to cause trouble. But you still start with that basic capability that technology gives you, and that is definitely a blessing. But whether people holding forth their opinions that they might otherwise keep to themselves, whether turning up the volume and the vileness of opinions is useful for society, which is often what user-generated content is. And I don't use Twitter very much. I occasionally look at different stories, different themes. But what you notice is that the comments on, somebody may have an observation that's questionable in its veracity or virtue, but the comments just get progressively extreme. And it tells you that some social media, and I don't mean to point out Twitter solely, but some social media rewards outrage in a way that is not enlightening. And what is the social efficacy of outrage? What is the social efficacy of articulated angst? And UGC that's angst articulated is very limited in its usefulness.
Robert, what do you, just sort of pulling on that thread a little bit, the issue of misinformation, disinformation, is this a risk actually across all forms of media, given the intense competition for sort of breaking news and so forth? And what do you think of Twitter's recent action to sort of label content as misinformation?
Well, at the moment, it's been done very selectively. If you're going to do that, then you have to do that across the entire political spectrum. Most of the debate is skewed one way at the moment, and you have to be realistic about misinformation being, frankly, common to all political persuasions. And that's not quite the debate that's taking place now. Ultimately, it will be the debate, but you have to make a distinction between someone's desire to censor opinion and someone's desire to ensure that falsity is not propagated. And that's a very delicate debate. If people of strong political opinions will look at a certain set of incidents, a certain set of facts, and are they viewing those facts through the prism of personal politics, or are they viewing those facts through the prism of veracity? And these are very philosophical issues that I'm not sure that the social media and digital companies have really thought through. And you can see that some of the actions taken of late have been more reactive than thoughtful. And unless there is a thoughtful policy, it will be encumbered by institutional inconsistency.
Yeah. So Robert, just want to shift gears to sort of geopolitical for a moment, if I could, as we come to the conclusion of this webinar. COVID has obviously heightened tensions between China and the US. You've had tremendous experience in China. It seems Australia is getting caught in the middle of all of that, given the trading relationship. What do you see as the current state of play? What could we expect going forward? And even connected to the upcoming presidential election, how prominent will the whole subject of China be, do you think?
Yeah, at the moment, both parties are out competing with each other to be more hawkish on China, but it's an election year. And I've spoken to Chinese officials and they understand it's an election year in the US, even though they're not accustomed to elections in China. China's role in the world and its emergence in the world is obviously changing the world. And if you have a slightly more historical perspective than beyond an election year, China hasn't really been assertive in global affairs since the 15th century. There was a Chinese admiral, Zheng He, who sailed to Africa and back to China and was part of a series of Chinese expeditions of exploring. And then China decided that China was more interesting than the rest of the world and put the shutters up. And then, as you know, with the Qing dynasty, which is the last of the dynasties, it started to implode. And 1911 and 1949, you had the Communist Revolution, then you had the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. China has come out of centuries of isolation and decades of crisis. And so China finds itself, and the Chinese leadership finds itself in the odd role of being influential in the world and having ambitions in the world for the first time in 600 years. And so my view is clearly you have to hold China to account and on Chinese trade abuses, which are clear. Intellectual property is important. Human rights are important. And on the trade issue, Chinese officials do see trade as something of a zero-sum game. So they understood why there needed to be trade negotiations with the US. There was no, and Liu He, the Chinese vice premier, who was responsible for those trade negotiations, who, frankly, I've had the privilege of getting to know over many years, is a very thoughtful internationalist. He's not a myopic nationalist at all. And he saw these trade negotiations, not only as a bilateral, which it was at heart, but that it had a multilateral component, which was China's redefining itself in the world. And I think the other mistake people make in trying to analyse movements in Beijing is to think of the Chinese government as monolithic. The Chinese Communist Party has factions in the same way that there are political factions in a different genre of politics, obviously, unrepresentative politics. But those factions are often at odds with each other. There's a lot of friction between those factions. And just as there are hawks and doves in Washington, there are hawks and doves in Beijing. Both countries have hawks. And one of the potential dangers, and it's still to be played out, and this year in particular will be an odd year to make any judgments because it's an election year in the US. But one of the potential dangers is that the rise of hawks in Washington will help the ascendance of hawks in Beijing as a reaction.
Yeah, interesting. Any comment around how Australia navigates its particular position? It's tricky, obviously, for Australia, given the strong relationship with the US and then the very important trade relationship with China.
It's an important relationship. It's right for Australia to be assertive, but it shouldn't be acerbic.
So Robert, last question for the evening, and I just want to sort of cycle all the way back to sort of the current state of affairs in the world. And we touched on this a little bit up front about what is going to have been a passing issue, what's going to be a permanent change, and your comments around the digital transformation of the news business, every business, quite frankly. Do you think when we look back on this particular sort of moment, will that be one of the lasting consequences, that acceleration of the digital economy, where, with us doing this conversation tonight on Zoom, everybody working from home, do you have care to speculate on what you think we might remember the most, or what the biggest consequence of all of this will have been?
Well, I guess there are the embarrassing Zoom moments, which I think we've successfully avoided. Well, I mean, you make a really fascinating point, but it's complementary in a way. Obviously, technology is more important. Touchless will be more important. There are endless screeds written on certain things, which just make sense, common sense, and are an acceleration and expediting of those pre-existing trends: touchless, automatic sanitizer dispensers, and you can see logically where that goes. But the fact that we've been able to have these digital teleworking relations it is amazing, and it's a testimony to your company's strong culture, to the culture that Rupert and Lachlan have created at News Corp. But it also reinforces the importance of human interaction in non-technical environments, because the only reason you can have these Zoom conversations and that they have meaning is because of pre-existing relationships. And one concern I think we should all have is that we're actually burning up social capital with each passing day. That we have a certain reserve of empathy that is partly extended by teleworking and Zoom conversations and Google Meet, but it's also eroded by those things because it doesn't have a truly emotional dimension to it. It is technically two-dimensional, and so we're learning how important technology is in our lives. I think we're also learning how important people are in our lives.
That is an excellent way to finish, and I certainly hope this webinar this evening is not a debit against my Robert Thomson social account. In fact, a credit, perhaps. Thank you, Robert. I think this has been a fascinating discussion, a really good way actually to close it out. And I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us this evening. Thank you for joining. We are going to have a replay of this session on our AAA website within the next 24 hours. And please keep an eye out for all the upcoming sessions that we are going to do. And thank you again very much, Robert, for joining us this evening.
Thank you all. Be safe, be sage.
Thank you, everyone.